The Flower Women by Clark Ashton Smith, originally published 1935. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. "Avle," said Ma'al-Dueb, "I suffer from the frightful curse of omnipotence. In all Shikarf and in the 5 outer planets of the triple suns, there is no one, there is nothing to dispute my domination. Therefore my ennui has become intolerable." The girlish eyes of Atle regarded the enchanter with a gaze of undying astonishment, which, however, was not due to his strange avowal. She was the last of the 51 women that Ma'al-Dueb had turned into statues in order to preserve their frail, corruptible beauty from the worm-like gnawing of time. Since, through a laudable desire to avoid monotony, he had resolved never to repeat again this particular sorcery, the magician had cherished Adelaide with the affection which an artist feels for the final masterpiece of a series. He had placed her on a little dais beside the ivory chair in his chamber of meditation. Often he addressed to her his queries or monologues, and the fact that she did not reply nor even hear was to him a signal and unfailing recommendation. "There is but one remedy for this boredom of mine," he went on. "The abnegation, at least for a while, of that all-too-certain power from which it springs. Therefore I, Ma'al-Dueb, the ruler of 6 worlds and all their moons, shall go forth alone, unheralded, and without other equipment than that which any fledgling sorcerer might possess. In this way, perhaps, I shall recover the lost charm of incertitude, the foregone enchantment of peril. Adventures that I have not foreseen will be mine, and the future will wear the alluring veil of the mysterious. It remains, however, to select the field of my adventurings." Ma'al-Dueb arose from his curiously carven chair and waved back the 4 automatons of iron, having the likeness of armed men that sprang to attend him. He passed along the halls of his palace, where painted hangings told in vermilion and purple the dread legends of his power. Through ebon valves that opened noiselessly at the uttering of a high-pitched word, he entered the chamber in which was his planetarium. The room was walled, floored, and vaulted with a dark crystal, full of tiny, numberless fires that gave the illusion of unbounded space with all its stars. In midair, without chains or other palpable support, there hung an array of various globes that represented the 3 suns, the 6 planets, and 13 moons of the system ruled by Ma'al-Dueb. The miniature suns, amber, emerald, and carmine, bathed their intricately circling worlds with an illumination that reproduced at all times the diurnal conditions of the system itself, and the pygmy satellites maintained always their corresponding orbits and relative positions. The sorcerer went forward, walking as if on some unfathomable gulf of night with stars and galaxies beneath him. The poisoning worlds were level with his shoulders as he passed among them. Disregarding the globes that corresponded to Mornoth, Shikarf, Ulasa, Nuf, and Ruhul, he came to Votalp, the outermost, which was then in Aphelion on the far side of the room. Votalp, a large and moonless world, revolved imperceptibly as he studied it. From one hemisphere he saw the yellow sun was at that time in total eclipse behind the sun of Carmine. But in spite of this and its greater distance from the solar triad, Votalp was lit with sufficient clearness. It was mottled with strange hues like a great cloudy opal, and the modelings were microscopic oceans, isles, mountains, jungles, and deserts. Peering closer, as if into a crystal, the enchanter saw the mimic planet swell and deepen. Fantastic sceneries leaped into momentary salience, taking on the definitude and perspective of actual landscapes, and then faded back amid the iridescent blur. Glimpses of teeming multifarious life, incredible tableaux, and monstrous happenings were beheld by Ma'al Dueb as he looked down like some celestial spy. It seemed, however, that he found little to divert or inveigle himself in these outre doings and exotic wonders. Vision after vision rose before him, summoned and dismissed at will, as if he were turning the pages of a too familiar volume, and he saw nothing over which he cared to linger. The wars of gigantic wyverns, the matings of half-vegetable monsters, the queer algae that had filled a certain ocean with their living, moving labyrinths, the remarkable spawn of certain polar glaciers, all these elicited no gleam nor sparkle in his dulled eyes of blackish emerald. At length, on that portion of the planet which was turning into the double dawn from its moonless night, he perceived an occurrence that drew and held his attention. He began to calculate for the first time the precise latitude and longitude of the surrounding milieu. "There," he said to himself, "is a situation not without interest. In fact, the whole affair is quaint and curious enough to warrant my intervention. I shall visit Votalp." He withdrew from the planetarium and made a few preparations for his meditated journey. Having changed his robe of magisterial sable and scarlet for a hodden mantle, and having removed from his person every charm and talisman, with the exception of 2 phylacteries acquired in the years of his novitiate, he went forth into the garden of his mountain-builded palace. He left no instructions with the many retainers who served him, for these retainers were automatons of iron and brass, who would fulfill their various duties without injunction till he returned. Traversing the curious labyrinth which he alone could solve, he came to the verge of the sheer mesa, where python-like lianas drooped into awful space, and metallic palms deployed their armaments of foliage against the far-flown horizons of the world Shikarf. Empires and cities lying supine beneath his magical dominion were unrolled before him, but giving them hardly a glance, he walked along the estrade of black samite at the very brink, till he reached a narrow promontory around which there hung at all times a deep and hueless cloud, obscuring the prospect of the lands below and beyond. The secret of this cloud, affording access to multiple dimensions and deeply folded realms of space conterminate with far worlds, was known only to Ma'al Dueb. He had built a silver drawbridge on the promontory, and by lowering its airy span into the cloud, he could pass at will to the further zones of Shikarf, or could cross the very void between the planets. Now, after making certain highly recondite calculations, he manipulated the machinery of the light drawbridge so that its other end would fall upon the particular terrain that he desired to visit in Votalp. Then, assuring himself that his calculations and adjustments were flawless, he followed the silver span into the dim, bewildering chaos of the cloud. Here, as he groped in a gray blindness, it seemed that his body and members were drawn out over infinite gulfs and were bent through impossible angles. A single misstep would have plunged him into spatial regions from which all his cunning sorcery could have contrived no manner of return or release. But he had often trod these hidden ways, and he did not lose his equilibrium. The transit appeared to involve whole centuries of time, but finally he emerged from the cloud and came to the further end of the drawbridge. Before him was the scene that had lured his interest in Votalp. It was a semi-tropic valley, level and open in the foreground, and rising steeply at the other extreme, with all its multiform fantasies of vegetation toward the cliffs and chasms of sable mountains horned with blood-red stone. The time was still early dawn, but the amber sun, freeing itself slowly from the occultation of the sun of Carmine, had begun to lighten the deep hues and shadows of the valley with strange copper and orange. The emerald sun was still below the horizon. The terminus of the silver bridge had fallen on a mossy knoll, behind which the hueless cloud had gathered, even as about the promontory in Shikarf. Maal Dueb descended the knoll, feeling no concern whatever for the bridge. It would remain as he had left it till the time of his return, and if, in the interim, any creatures from Votalp should cross the gulf and invade his mountain citadel, they would meet a fearful doom in the snares and windings of the labyrinth, or, failing this, would be exterminated by his iron servitors. As he went down the knoll into the valley, the enchanter heard an eerie, plaintive singing, like the voices of sirens who bewail some irremediable misfortune. The singing came from a sisterhood of unusual creatures, half woman and half flower, that grew on the valley bottom beside a sleepy stream of purple water. There were several scores of these lovely and charming monsters whose feminine bodies of pink and pearl reclined amid the vermilion velvet couches of billowing petals to which they were attached. These petals were borne on single mattress-like leaves and heavy, short, well-rooted stems. The flowers were disposed in irregular circles, clustering thickly toward the center, and with open intervals in the outer rows. Maal Dueb approached the flower women with a certain caution, for he knew that they were vampires. Their arms ended in long tendrils, pale as ivory, swifter and more supple than the coils of darting serpents with which they were wont to secure the unwary victims, drawn by their singing. Of course, knowing in his wisdom the inexorable laws of nature, he felt no disapproval of such vampirism, but on the other hand he did not care to be its object. He circled about the strange family at a little distance, his movements hidden from their observation by boulders overgrown with luxuriant lichens of red and yellow. Soon he neared the straggling outer line of plants that were upstream from the knoll on which he had landed, and here, in confirmation of the vision beheld in the mimic world in his planetarium, he found that the turf was upheaved and broken where 5 of the blossoms, growing apart from their companions, had been disrooted and removed bodily. He had seen in his vision the rape of the 5th flower, and he knew that the others were now lamenting her. Suddenly, as if they had forgotten their sorrow, the wailing of the flower women turned into a wild and sweet and voluptuous singing like that of the lorelei. By this token the enchanter knew that his presence had been detected. Inured though he was to such bewitchments, Maal Dueb found himself far from insensible to the perilous luring of the voices. Contrary to his intention, half forgetful of the danger, he found himself emerging from the lee of the lichen-crested rocks. By insidious degrees, the melody began to fire his blood with a strange intoxication. It sang in his brain like some bewildering wine. Step by step, with a temporary loss of prudence for which, later, he was quite unable to account, he approached the canorous blossoms. Now, pausing at an interval that he deemed safe in his bemusement, he beheld plainly the half-human features of the vampires, leaning toward him with fantastic invitation. Their weirdly slanted eyes, like oblong opals of dew and venom, the snaky coiling of their bronze-green hair, the bright, baneful scarlet of their lips, that thirsted subtly even as they sang, awoke within him the knowledge of his peril. Too late, he sought to defy the captiously woven spell, unwinding with a movement swift as light. The long, pale tendrils of one of the creatures wrapped him round, and he was drawn, resisting vainly, toward her couch. At the moment of his capture, the whole sisterhood had ceased their singing. They began to utter little cries of triumph, shrill and sibilant, murmurs of expectation, like the purrings of hungry flame, arose from the nearest who hoped to share in the good fortune of the sorcerer's captress. Maal Dueb, however, was now able to utilize his faculties. Without alarm or fear, he contemplated the lovely monster who had drawn him to the verge of her velvet bed and was fawning upon him with sinisterly parted lips. Using a somewhat primary power of divination, he apprised himself of certain matters concerning the vampire. Having learnt the true occult name which this creature shared with all others of her kind, he then spoke the name aloud in a firm but gentle tone. And winning thus, by an eternal law of magic, the power of mastery over his captress and her sisters, he felt the instant relaxation of the tendrils. The flower woman, with fear and wonder in her strange eyes, drew back like a startled lamia, but Maal Dueb, employing the half-articulate sounds of her own language, began to soothe and reassure her. In a little while he was on friendly terms with the whole sisterhood. These simple and naive beings forgot their vampiric intentions, their surprise and wonderment, and seemed to accept the magician very much as they accepted the three suns and the meteoric conditions of the planet Votalp. Conversing with them, he soon verified the information obtained through the mimic globe. As a rule, their emotions and memories were short-lived, their nature being closer to that of plants or animals than of humankind, but the loss of 5 sisters, occurring on successive mornings, had filled them with grief and terror that they could not forget. The missing flowers had been carried away bodily. The depredators were certain reptilian beings, colossal in size and winged like pterodactyls, who came down from their new-built citadel among the red and sable mountains at the valley's upper extreme. These beings, known as the Ispazars, 7 in number, had become formidable sorcerers, developing an intellection beyond that of their kind, together with many esoteric faculties. Preserving the cold and evilly cryptic nature of reptiles, they had made themselves the masters of an abhuman science. But until the present, Maal Dueb had ignored them and had not thought it worth while to interfere with their evolution. Now, through an errant whim, in his search for adventure, he had decided to pit himself against the Ispazars, employing no other weapons of sorcery than his own wit and will, his remembered learning, his clairvoyance, and the 2 simple amulets that he wore on his person. "Be comforted," he said to the flower women, "for verily I shall deal with these miscreants in a fitting manner." At this, they broke into a shrill babble, repeating tales the bird people of the valley had borne to them, regarding the fortress of the Ispazars, whose walls rose sheerly from a hidden peak unscaled by man, and were void of portal or window save in the highmost ramparts, where the flying reptiles went in and out. And they told him other tales concerning the ferocity and cruelty of the Ispazars. Smiling as if at the chatter of children, he diverted their thoughts to other matters and told them many stories of odd and curious marvels and queer happenings in alien worlds. In the meanwhile, he perfected his plan for obtaining entrance to the citadel of the reptilian wizards. The day went by in such divertissements, and one by one the three suns of the system fell beyond the valley's rim. The flower women grew inattentive. They began to nod and drowse in the richly darkening twilight, and Maal Dweb proceeded with certain preparations that formed an essential part of his scheme. Through his power of second sight, he had determined the identity of the victim whom the winged reptiles would carry away in their next raid on the morrow. This creature, as it happened, was the one who had sought to ensnare him. Like the others, she was now preparing to fold herself for the night in her couch of voluminous petals. Confiding part of his plan to her, Maal Dweb manipulated in a singular fashion one of the amulets which he wore, and by virtue of this manipulation reduced himself to the proportions of a pygmy. In this state, with the assistance of the drowsy siren, he was able to conceal himself in a hollow space among the petals, and thus embowered, like a bee in a rose, he slept securely through the short, moonless night of Votalp. The dawn awakened him, glowing as if through loosened curtains of ruby and purple. He heard the flower women murmuring sleepily to one another as they opened their blossoms to the early suns. Their murmurs, however, soon changed into shrill cries of agitation and fear, and above the cries there came a vibrant drumming as of great dragon wings. He peered from his hiding place and saw in the double dawn the descent of the Ispazars, from whose webbed vans a darkness fell on the valley. Nearer they drew, and he saw their cold and scarlet eyes beneath scaly brows, their long and undulant bodies, their lizard limbs with prehensile claws, and he heard the deep, articulate hissing of their voices. Then the petals closed about him blindly, shuddering and constrictive as the flower woman recoiled from the swooping monsters. All was confusion, terror, tumult, but he knew from his observation of the previous rape that two of the Ispazars had encircled the flower's stem with their python-like tails, and were pulling it from the ground as a human sorcerer might pull a mandrake plant. He felt the convulsive agony of the disrooted blossom. He heard the lamentable shrieking of her sisters. Then there came a heavier beating of the drum-loud wings, and the feeling of giddy ascension and flight. Through all this, Maal Dweb had maintained the utmost presence of mind, and he did not betray himself to the Ispazars. After many minutes there was a slackening of the headlong flight, and he knew that the reptiles were nearing their citadel. A moment more, and the ruddy gloom of the shut petals darkened and purpled about him, as if they had passed from the sunlight into a place of deep shadow. The thrumming of wings ceased abruptly. The living flower was dropped as if from a height on some hard surface, and Maal Dweb was nearly hurled from his hiding place by the violence of her fall. Moaning faintly, twitching a little, she lay where her captors had flung her. The enchanter heard the hissing voices of the reptile wizards, the rough, sharp slithering of their scaly tails on a stone floor as they withdrew. Whispering words of comfort to the dying blossom, he felt the petals relax about him. He crept forth very cautiously and found himself in an immense, gloomily concamenated hall, whose windows were like the mouths of a deep cavern. The place was a sort of alchemy, a den of alien sorceries and abhorrent pharmaceutics. Everywhere in the gloom there were vats, couples, furnaces, alembics, and mattresses of unhuman form, bulking and towering colossally to the pygmy eyes of Maal Dweb. Close at hand, a monstrous cauldron fumed like a crater of black metal, its curving sides ascending far above the magician's head. None of the Ispazars was in sight, but Knowing that they might return at any moment, he hastened to make ready against them, feeling for the first time in many years the thrill of peril and expectation. Manipulating the second amulet, he regained his normal proportions. The room, though still spacious, was no longer a hall of giants, and the cauldron beside him sank and lessened till its rim rose only to his shoulder. He saw now that the cauldron was filled with an unholy mixture of ingredients, among which were finely shredded portions of the missing flower women, together with the gall of chimeras and the ambergris of leviathans. Heated by unseen fires, it boiled tumultuously, foaming with black pitchy bubbles and putting forth a nauseous vapor. With the shrewd eye of a past master of all chemic lore, Mal Dueb proceeded to estimate the various contents of the cauldron, and was then able to divine the purpose for which the brewage was intended. The conclusion to which he was driven appalled him slightly, and served to heighten his respect for the power and science of the reptile sorcerers. He saw, indeed, that it would be highly advisable to arrest their evolution. After brief reflection, it occurred to him that, in accordance with chemical laws, the adding of certain simple components to the brewage would bring about an eventuation neither desired nor anticipated by the Ispazars. On high tables, about the walls of the alchemy, there were jars, flasks, and vials containing curious drugs and powerful elements, some of which were drawn from the more arcanic kingdoms of nature. Disregarding the moon powder, the coals of starfire, the jellies made from the brains of gorgons, the ichor of salamanders, the dust of lethal fungi, the marrow of sphinxes, and other equally quaint and pernicious matters, the magician soon found the essences that he required. It was the work of an instant to pour them into the seething cauldron, and having done this, he awaited with composure the return of the reptiles. The flower woman, in the meanwhile, had ceased to moan and twitch. Mal Dueb knew that she was dead, since beings of this genus were unable to survive long when uprooted with such violence from their natal soil. She had folded herself to the face in her straightened petals, as if in a red and blackening shroud. He regarded her briefly, not without commiseration, and at that moment he heard the voices of the 7 Ispazars, who had now re-entered the alchemy. They came toward him among the crowded vessels, walking erect, in the fashion of men on their short lizard legs, their ribbed and sable wings retracted behind them, and their eyes glaring redly in the gloom. 2 of them were armed with long, sinuous-bladed knives, and others were equipped with enormous adamantine pestles, to be employed, no doubt, in bruising the flesh of the floral vampire. When they saw the enchanter, they were both startled and angered. Their necks and torsos began to swell like the hoods of cobras, and a great hissing rose among them, like the noise of jetted steam. Their aspect would have struck terror to the heart of any common man, but Mal Dueb confronted them calmly, repeating aloud in low, even tones a word of sovereign protective power. The Ispazars hurled themselves toward him, some running along the floor with an undulant slithering motion, and others rising on rapid-beating vans to attack him from above. All, however, dashed themselves vainly on the sphere of unseen force he had drawn about him, through the utterance of the word of power. It was a strange thing to see them clawing vengefully at the void air, or striking futile blows with their weapons, which rang as if on a brazen wall. Now, perceiving that the man before them was a sorcerer, the reptile magicians began to make use of their own abhuman sorcery. They called from the air great bolts of livid flame, python-shapen, which leaped and writhed incessantly, warring with the sphere of protective power, driving it back as a shield is driven by press of numbers in battle, but never breaking it down entirely. Also, they chanted evil, sibilant runes that were designed to charm away the magician's memory and cause him to forget his magic. Sore was the travail of Mal Dueb as he fought the serpent fires and runes, and blood mingled with the sweat of his brow from the endeavor. But still, as the bolts struck nearer and the singing loudened, he kept uttering the unforgotten word, and the word still protected him. Now, above the snaky chanting, he heard the deep hiss of the cauldron, boiling more turbulently than before because of those matters which he had added to its contents. And he saw, between the ever-writhing bolts, that a more voluminous vapor, dark as the steam of a primal fen, was mounting from the cauldron and was spreading throughout the alchemy. Soon the Aspazars were immersed in the fumes, as in a cloud of darkness, and dimly they began to coil and twist, convulsed with a strange agony. The python flames died out on the air, and the hissings of the Ispazars became inarticulate as those of common serpents. Then, falling to the floor while the black mist gathered and thickened above them, they crawled to and fro on their bellies in the fashion of true reptiles, and emerging at times from the vapor, they seemed to shrink and dwindle as if hellfire had consumed them. All this was even as Mal Dueb had planned. He knew that the Ispazars had forgotten their sorcery and science, and a swift devolution, flinging them back to the lowest state of serpenthood, had come upon them through the action of the vapor. But before the completion of the change, he admitted one of the 7 Ispazars to the sphere that now served to protect him from the fumes. The creature fawned at his feet like a tame dragon, acknowledging him for its master. Presently the cloud of vapor began to lift, and he saw the other Ispazars, who were now little larger than fen snakes. Their wings had withered into useless frills, and they crept and hissed on the floor of the alchemy amid the alembics and crucibles and athanors of their lost science. Mal Dueb regarded them for a little, not without pride in his own sorcery. The struggle had been difficult, even dangerous, and he reflected that his boredom had been thoroughly overcome, at least for the nonce. From a practical viewpoint, he had done well, for in ridding the flower women of their persecutors, he had also eradicated a possible future menace to his own dominion over the worlds of the 3 suns. Turning to that Ispazar which he had spared for a necessary purpose, he seated himself firmly astride its back, behind the thick jointing of the vans. He spoke a magic word that was understood by the monster. Bearing him between its wings, it rose and flew obediently through one of the high windows, and leaving behind it forever the citadel that was not to be scaled by man, nor by any wingless creature, it carried the magician over the red horns of the sable mountains, across the valley where dwelt the sisterhood of floral vampires, and descended on the mossy knoll at the end of that silver bridge whereby he had entered Votalp. There Mal Dueb dismounted, and followed by the crawling Ispazar, he began his return journey to Shikarf through the hueless cloud above the multi-dimensional deeps. Midway in that peculiar transit, he heard a sharp, sudden clapping of wings. It ceased with remarkable abruptness and was not repeated. Looking back, he found that the Ispazar had fallen from the bridge and was vanishing brokenly amid irreconcilable angles in the gulf from which there was no return. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.